In the small conservative town of Willowbrook, Dr. Elizabeth Morgan was a trailblazer. A renowned psychiatrist, she had made it her life's work to challenge the conventional understanding of hysteria, a condition that had, for centuries, been attributed to women who were perceived as overly emotional or irrational. Elizabeth's interest in hysteria had begun during her medical training, when she encountered the case files of countless women who had been diagnosed with the condition. She couldn't help but notice that the symptoms were frequently vague and seemed to be more about societal expectations than any actual medical issue. As she delved deeper into the history of hysteria, Elizabeth discovered that it had long been believed to be caused by a wandering womb, which was thought to move throughout a woman's body, causing a range of symptoms from anxiety to paralysis. This ancient theory had persisted, despite there being no scientific evidence to support it. Determined to challenge the status quo, Elizabeth began her research, studying the latest neurological and psychological research on sexual desire and arousal. She came to believe that hysteria wasn't a disease at all, but rather a manifestation of women's strong and natural sexual desires, which had been repressed by society for far too long. As she shared her findings with her colleagues, Elizabeth faced a barrage of skepticism and even outrage. Many of her peers refused to entertain the idea that hysteria could be anything other than a mental disorder, and some even accused her of promoting promiscuity. Undeterred, Elizabeth continued her research, gathering evidence to support her theory. One day, while browsing through an old medical textbook, Elizabeth came across an article about the work of Dr. Sigmund Freud, a pioneer in the field of psychoanalysis. Freud had posited that hysteria could be treated through therapy and the talking cure, a concept that aligned with Elizabeth's own beliefs. Intrigued, she decided to visit Freud in his clinic in Vienna to learn more. The meeting between Elizabeth and Freud was a pivotal moment in the history of psychiatry. Freud, impressed by Elizabeth's passion and determination, agreed to collaborate with her on a groundbreaking study of hysteria. Together, they set out to investigate the condition by analyzing the case histories of hundreds of patients, both male and female, who had been diagnosed with hysteria. As they delved into the data, a fascinating pattern began to emerge. They found that the symptoms of hysteria were often triggered by events of emotional or physical trauma, particularly those related to sexuality. Furthermore, they observed that the severity of symptoms tended to worsen when the patients attempted to repress their memories or emotions. Elizabeth and Freud came to the conclusion that hysteria was not a disease, but rather a psychological defense mechanism that allowed individuals to cope with overwhelming emotions or experiences. By labeling these feelings as hysteria, society had enabled individuals to avoid confronting and addressing the root causes of their distress. As their research progressed, Elizabeth and Freud began to explore alternative treatments for hysteria. They developed a technique they called sexual abrasion, which involved patients recounting their traumatic experiences in a safe and supportive environment, allowing them to process and understand their emotions without judgment. This approach often led to a reduction in hysterical symptoms, as patients were finally able to confront and work through the underlying issues. The publication of their findings sparked a fierce debate within the medical community, with many psychiatrists and psychologists questioning the validity of their research and accusing Elizabeth and Freud of promoting sexual promiscuity. However, their work began to change the way people thought about hysteria and paved the way for a more nuanced understanding of mental health and sexuality. Despite the backlash, Elizabeth remained undaunted. She continued her research, focusing on the role of sexual desire and repression in the development of hysteria. She discovered that women who experienced a strong and healthy sexual desire were less likely to develop hysteria, as they were more in touch with their emotions and more able to express and process their feelings. Armed with this knowledge, Elizabeth began to advocate for a shift in societal attitudes towards female sexuality, arguing that women should be encouraged to explore and understand their desires rather than being shamed or pathologized for them. She believed that by fostering a more open and accepting environment for discussing sexuality, women could develop healthier coping mechanisms for dealing with emotional and psychological challenges, ultimately reducing the incidence of hysteria. To further her cause, Elizabeth began to educate the public about the importance of sexual education and open communication within relationships. She gave lectures and wrote articles discussing the role of sexual desire in women's lives and the harm caused by labeling their emotions as hysteria. As her message spread, a small but growing number of people began to appreciate the significance of her work. Women, in particular, found solace in her message, as they began to understand that their feelings and desires were not a sign of mental illness, but rather a natural part of their identity. One of those women was Amelia, a young mother who had been diagnosed with hysteria after experiencing panic attacks and mood swings following the birth of her child. Feeling as though her emotions were spiraling out of control, she had sought help from a psychiatrist who quickly diagnosed her with hysteria and prescribed a regimen of sedatives and therapy. Despite the treatments, Amelia's condition worsened. She felt trapped and ashamed, believing that her emotions were a sign of weakness. One day, while browsing a bookstore, she stumbled upon one of Elizabeth's articles, which proposed that hysteria could be a manifestation of women's strong sexual desires. Intrigued, Amelia decided to seek out Elizabeth's help. Under Elizabeth's guidance, Amelia began to explore her feelings and experiences, eventually discovering that her panic attacks and mood swings were triggered by unresolved issues in her marriage, including a lack of emotional and physical intimacy. As she worked through these issues with Elizabeth's support, Amelia's symptoms gradually subsided, and she began to feel like herself again. With each success story, Elizabeth's reputation grew, and her message began to resonate with a wider audience. Slowly but surely, society began to shift its perception of hysteria, moving away from the archaic idea of a wandering womb and toward a more nuanced understanding of female sexuality and mental health.
Please subscribe to my channel Lessons of Life and press the bell notification icon.